billions of dollars of global capital. I mean, corporate survival, market dominance, all of it hinges on a handful of decisions made in rooms that, frankly, most people will never enter.
Right.
And stepping into a foreign market or, launching a new product line, attempting to restructure an entire industry, it's essentially like walking into a minefield blindfolded. I mean, one wrong step, one miscalculated variable, and a massive multinational operation is just reduced to ash.
Yeah, but the people who actually survive those minefields, they aren't relying on luck.
No.
They have a map. They rely on this highly specific, um, rigidly structured architecture of logic. Because when the stakes are in the billions, you cannot afford the luxury of guessing.
Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're opening the vault on the elite blueprints used by the world's most powerful strategists to orchestrate global markets.
This is the underlying code, really.
Exactly. We are decoding the fundamental operating code of global capitalism. Specifically, the core frameworks used by top-tier management consultants to break down complex global power structures. We're going to dissect massive market entries, focusing heavily on the mechanics of the NBO's aggressive expansion into China, and we'll identify the hidden structural forces that determine who actually wins and loses on the global chessboard. So if you value uncompromising, long-form breakdowns of how global business mechanics actually function, make sure you subscribe. We go this deep every single time.
Absolutely.
So let's establish the foundational problem here. We're talking about multi-million, sometimes multi-billion-dollar global expansion decisions. Why do the world's top analysts and consulting firms rely on this rigid four-part framework to solve these problems? I mean, why not just rely on the gut instinct or, the decades of experience of their top executives?
Well, because human intuition simply does not scale to the complexity of a globalized economy. I mean, when you're dealing with a multinational operation, the sheer volume of variables it's staggering. You've got currency fluctuations, local regulatory frameworks, shifting consumer behaviors, supply chain logistics.
It's too much for one person's gut.
Exactly. If you rely on gut instinct, even the highly refined instinct of a seasoned CEO, you are inevitably going to suffer from a catastrophic blind spot. So the framework we're analyzing today, the business situation framework, is fundamentally an anatomy of a business problem. It forces you to categorize the chaos into four critical pillars.
And those are?
The customer, the product, the company itself, and the competition.
So it's basically pure risk mitigation.
Completely. Think of it much like a commercial pilot's pre-flight checklist, or even a quantitative trader's back-tested algorithmic model.
Right, because a quant trader doesn't just build a model and throw millions of dollars at the live market on day one.
Exactly. They take 10 years of historical data and run the model backward to see if it would have predicted past market movements. And this consulting framework was built the exact same way. It was constructed by repeatedly looking at failed business cases, autopsying the wreckage, and asking, what specific variable did we miss?
And then they just add that variable to the checklist.
Right, so it systematically flushes out the critical insights. It gets you to the halfway point. In today's highly complex economy, missing a single variable can sink you.
Yeah.
You might have the best product in the world, manufactured at the lowest cost. But if you miss a shift in customer distribution channel preferences, meaning how they actually prefer to execute the transaction, the entire multinational operation collapses.
Well, let's dig right into that, because the architecture insists on starting exactly there, right?
Yeah.
With the customer. You don't just say, oh, our customers are the people buying our product. The baseline demand of this logic is that you must segment the market.
Because looking at customers overall is dangerously misleading. The framework demands that you ask, who are they? What does each specific segment want? What are they willing to pay?
Right.
And, crucially, how do they prefer to buy? Think about how market researchers actually visualize this data. They don't use raw spreadsheets in the boardroom. They use avatars. This is actually where the concept of the soccer mom comes from.
Oh, right, because soccer mom isn't just some cultural punchline or a lazy stereotype. It originated as a hard data visualization tool for the automotive industry, didn't it?
Exactly. The original market research identified a highly specific demographic segment, women with an average of 1.5 children, with the oldest child around age 5. And mathematically, this segment was highly attracted to the utility and safety of a minivan.
But if you walk into a boardroom of executives and just read off the stats like demographic cohort 4B, median age 34, their eyes just glaze over.
You completely lose the narrative. They needed a shorthand to visualize that data point to make strategic decisions. So they called them soccer moms. You have to understand who these people are qualitatively and then map them mathematically.
What happens if a company skips this step, though? Like, what if they just look at the aggregate data and design a product for the average consumer?
Well, the structural force behind segmentation is understanding that different segments have entirely different and often conflicting needs. So if you do not segment, you average out the needs of your market.
Makes sense.
If one segment wants a highly durable, expensive tool, and another segment wants a lightweight, disposable, cheap tool, and you average those needs, you end up producing a medium-weight, moderately priced tool that perfectly satisfies absolutely no one.
Right, you engineer your own obsolescence by trying to please everyone.
Precisely.
Okay, I understand the theory of segmenting the customer based on what they want to buy,
Yeah.
but I want to explore that distribution channel aspect you mentioned, how they want to buy.
Mm.
Because if the product is superior and the price is right, why does the mechanism of the transaction matter so much? I'm struggling to see how a bad distribution channel actually destroys market share if the core product is undeniably great.
It destroys market share because of implementation friction. Let's look at a structural blind spot that this framework exposes perfectly. Imagine you're selling highly expensive, complex enterprise software at hardware.
Okay.
Your target segment is the Fortune 500 Chief Information Officer, the CIO. The framework asks, what is the distribution channel of preference for this specific segment? In this scenario, the CIO is managing a massive, fragile corporate network. They want a single point of contact.
Right, they want to deal with one unified system integrator, like a senior partner at Accenture or Deloitte or something.
Exactly. They implicitly trust that one single architect to orchestrate the hardware, the software, the installation, the maintenance.
They're buying a holistic solution, not a pile of parts. They want one neck to choke if the system goes down.
Exactly. Now look at how the vendor company is structured. A massive tech conglomerate might be organized strictly by product line to maximize internal efficiency, right?
Yeah.
So to serve that one CIO, they send 5 different salespeople to the pitch. One from hardware, one from software, one from cloud servers, security, maintenance.
Uh-huh.
The CIO is suddenly forced to interface with 5 different representatives, none of whom understand the entire systemic need of the client's architecture.
Ah, so the mismatch is entirely structural.
The customer demands Channel A unified, overarching consultant. The company forces them into Channel B fragmented, siloed product specialists. And the CIO finds the administrative friction of managing 5 different vendor silos totally unacceptable.
So what do?
They take their multi-million-dollar contract to a competitor who aligns with their buying preference, even if that competitor's underlying technology is slightly inferior.
Wow. So if you're listening to this and you've ever had to deal with a company where the left hand doesn't know what the right hand is doing, where you have to explain your problem to 5 different customer service reps in 5 different departments, you are experiencing a structural framework failure in real time.
Yes.
The market share is destroyed not because the technology failed, but because the internal corporate org chart was completely out of sync with the external market's distribution preference.
Which elevates this from a simple, know your customer marketing platitude into a ruthless structural audit. If your internal corporate silos do not map onto external market desires, you lose.
Let's escalate this. Let's take this theoretical architecture and apply it to the ultimate global chessboard. I want to look at a highly detailed, real-world application of this logic from the source material. The National Basketball Association determining if and how to fully enter the Chinese market.
Oh, this is a phenomenal pressure test of the framework because the scale is just so massive.
Right, so the setup is this. The NBA has recently completed a pilot program broadcasting NBA Finals games in China to test the waters. The commissioner comes to the consulting firm and asks the million-dollar question. Should we enter this market permanently? And if so, how do we execute?
Right.
If we're using the architecture, where do we start?
It forces us straight back to the customer and demand pillar. We need the data from that pilot program. We need to measure the baseline demand. And the numbers, the framework extracts from this pilot are just staggering. They achieved 100 million viewers for these test broadcasts.
Wait, 100 million?
Yes. To put that in perspective, that is roughly 5 times the viewership of the games in the U.S. domestic market.
5 times the domestic market. I mean, for a global analyst, alarms are going off. The scale is unprecedented. It's essentially an entire Super Bowl audience tuning in for standard playoff games.
Exactly.
But as we just discussed, we can't look at aggregate numbers. We have to segment those 100 million viewers. Who exactly are they?
The demographic breakdown is incredibly precise, and it's what makes the opportunity so explosive. 80% of the viewers are men. Of those men, 80% are under the age of 20. And crucially, 80% of those young men actively play basketball themselves.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, this isn't just passive novelty viewing by people flipping through channels. This is highly engaged, active participation by a specific demographic cohort.
Furthermore, the cultural penetration is absolute. When you look at the historical data of this case, analysts found that in extremely rural, impoverished areas in central China, places that lacked basic television infrastructure, Michael Jordan was already a universally recognized figure.
Right.
The brand penetration, the cultural mythos of the NBA had actually preceded the physical broadcasting infrastructure.
But here's where the framework forces a brutal pivot. 100 million highly engaged viewers is a phenomenal metric, but viewers do not equal profit in the media business.
Right.
If you are analyzing this at an elite level, you cannot stop at the viewer and celebrate. You have to find the economic engine. You have to ask, who is actually paying the bill?
Because the viewer watching a free broadcast isn't giving the NBA any money. This is the fundamental dual-sided nature of media businesses. The viewer is actually the product being packaged and sold. The advertiser is the actual paying customer.
Exactly. So the framework shifts the lens. Who are the advertisers buying time during this pilot program? Are they local regional entities or are they massive global players? And the data reveals the primary advertisers are massive multinational corporations, specifically companies like Procter & Gamble.
Why is P&G so interested in Chinese teenagers watching basketball?
Because P&G is desperate to reach this exact demographic, young Chinese man, teens to early 30s. From a consumer packaged goods perspective, brand loyalty is established early. If you can capture a male consumer in his late teens, you might secure his purchasing habits for the next 40 years.
But they couldn't reach them before.
No, they were experiencing severe difficulty reaching them because at the time, there was a massive lack of compelling media choices targeting that specific demographic in the region.
So P&G has billions of dollars in global marketing budget, a highly specific target demographic they desperately need to hit, and no structural vehicle to get there. The NBA suddenly arrives as the perfect delivery mechanism.
Yes.
What are the economics of that delivery?
Highly favorable. The framework prompts us to look at pricing power. Because the NBA is delivering a captive, targeted audience that P&G cannot find anywhere else,
Yeah.
the advertisers are willing to pay premium rates. We're looking at a hypothetical $25 CPM,
Cost per mil.
right, which is the cost an advertiser pays for 1,000 views or impressions of an ad. A $25 CPM in an emerging market is incredibly strong.
And just as importantly, we have to look at distribution channels again. How do these massive multinationals actually like to buy their advertising space? They don't want to negotiate directly with individual local Chinese television networks. That introduces massive administrative friction, currency risk, translation issues.
Exactly. They want to buy through their existing massive global ad agencies. They want to call their representative at BBDO or Ogilvy and Mather and say, allocate $50 million to the Chinese youth market.
Which is a massive strategic advantage for the NBA because the NBA already utilizes those exact same global agencies to sell the vast majority of its advertising space back in the US and Europe. The alignment is flawless.
Seamless.
The paying customer P&G wants to buy through Ogilvy, the supplier the NBA already sells through Ogilvy, the friction to execute the transaction is practically zero.
It is a seamless integration of global capital. You have a massive, untapped audience, a desperate, deep-pocketed payer, and pre-existing trusted financial pipelines to connect them. If you stop the analysis here looking only at the customer and product pillars, it looks like a guaranteed multi-billion-dollar success.
Wait.
But the framework demands we keep moving. We have to look at the competition and the political nuances of the host country.
Let's examine the media landscape because this is where the structural forces of the state come into play. What does the competition actually look like in China at this time?
Well, the analysis reveals a very stark, highly unusual dichotomy. When you look at the sheer volume of media programming produced and broadcast, the actual hours of television available, 80% of it is local, native Chinese programming, and only 20% is overseas or foreign content.
Okay.
However, when you look at actual viewership where the human eyeballs are voluntarily spending their time, the ratio inverts entirely. 80% of the viewership is consumed by that tiny 20% slice of overseas content.
That is an astonishing imbalance. The local content has a near monopoly on airtime, but the foreign content has a near monopoly on human attention. Why?
We have to look at this impartially, strictly as an analysis of media strategy and market dynamics. The historical context of the local programming, specifically the state-run channels, reveals a different set of incentives. The content isn't optimized for commercial entertainment. It's optimized for other state functions.
Let's look at the specific anecdote from the source material about the local cinema, because I think it perfectly illustrates the psychological dynamic at play.
Right. There's a well-documented observation from analysts operating in the region at the time regarding the narrative structure of local films. An analyst takes a local family member to a highly promoted, locally produced movie. The narrative of the film is incredibly bleak.
Like, tragedy from start to finish.
Yes. It's an arduous, depressing storyline where essentially everyone dies in tragedy by the end. The analyst is concerned this will be upsetting, but the local perspective is entirely different. The underlying logic presented is that you go to the cinema to watch something miserable, so that when you leave the theater and walk back into your real life, you feel a sense of relief.
Wow.
You feel excited that your actual life, whatever its hardships, is comparatively better than what you just watched.
Let's analyze the mechanics of that. If a state-influenced media apparatus prioritizes ideological messaging, historical struggle, or specific psychological conditioning over pure, unadulterated dopamine and entertainment, it creates an artificial vacuum in the market. The media isn't designed to be aspirational. It's designed to promote social cohesion through shared, mediated hardship.
Viewed strictly as a structural mechanism, yes, it creates a massive qualitative void. The local audience, especially the youth demographic, is actively seeking escapism, aspirational content, and dynamic, high-energy entertainment. But the local production market is structurally disincentivized from producing that exact type of content.
And this entirely explains why the 20% of overseas programming is capturing 80% of the attention. The population has a massive, unfulfilled dopamine deficit. There is a desperate hunger for what the NBA offers. High-energy, globally recognized, aspirational sports entertainment. It is a competitive vacuum masquerading as a saturated television market.
Exactly. The competition isn't actually competing for the same psychological need.
But stepping into a competitive vacuum in a foreign market isn't just about showing up with a satellite dish. The framework explicitly forces us to look at barriers to entry. And this is where the friction of global capitalism gets very real. This is not a free market. You don't just walk into Beijing and start broadcasting.
Far from it. When the analyst in the framework asks about barriers to entry for a foreign media producer, the reality is incredibly harsh. You're dealing with immense regulatory hurdles, complex bureaucratic red tape, and a completely different legal architecture regarding media rights.
Right.
The friction is intentionally high. It is designed by the state to keep foreign cultural influence out, or at the very least, highly contained and regulated.
I want to understand the mechanics of how they bypass this. If the barriers are historically that high, how did the NBA successfully execute the pilot program, and how are they planning to stay? You don't just ask a foreign regulatory body for a monopoly. How does that negotiation actually work?
Well, this is where the strategy is a masterpiece of aligning incentives. The NBA didn't just try to climb over the barrier. They negotiated a structure that turned the barrier into their own personal moat. They secured a 10-year exclusive agreement to provide sports content programming.
But why would the state grant that?
Because it solves a problem for the state as well. The state recognizes the massive youth demand for entertainment. If they simply open the floodgates to all Western media, they lose control of the cultural narrative. But by granting an exclusive monopoly to one specific entity, the NBA, the state, gets a highly controlled single point of contact for a cultural import that doesn't threaten core political stability.
Right. Basketball is universally beloved, but it isn't inherently politically subversive.
Exactly. The state satisfies the youth demand while maintaining administrative control.
And in exchange for playing by those strict rules, the NBA gets the holy grail of global business. They get an impenetrable barrier to entry. No other foreign sports league, not the Premier League, not the NFL, can enter that market and compete on the same scale because the NBA holds the exclusive regulatory keys for a decade.
Yes.
They have monopoly access to a demographic of 100 million people, fully funded by desperate Western multinationals, operating in a market with zero direct competition.
At this point in the analysis, the recommendation seems blindingly obvious. Enter the market immediately. Deploy the capital. But, and this is critical, the framework has one more pillar we haven't touched. The company itself. The internal financials of the mothership.
And this is where the twist drops.
The analyst asks for the overall financial situation of the NBA globally. Not just the China pilot, but the core business. And the hypothetical title drops like a bomb.
Yeah.
The NBA is currently bleeding cash globally.
Uh-oh.
Yeah. On total revenues of $100 million, they're losing $10 million a year. And their total cash reserves are sitting at only $30 million.
Wait, stop. Let's do the math on that. If you are generating 100 million, but your expenses are 110 million, you are losing 10 million a year. If you only have 30 million in the bank, you are exactly 3 years away from total insolvency. You are heading straight for a brick wall at 150 miles an hour. You cannot make payroll in 36 months.
Exactly. And this completely changes the risk profile of the entire China expansion. It doesn't matter how good the external market looks if the internal engine is failing.
Right.
Now, we have to look at the specific cost structure of the Chinese operation. The data shows that the China venture is actually a very low fixed cost investment. Out of the $2 million total spend to launch in China, $1.8 million is fixed, meaning infrastructure, legal fees, initial setup, and $200,000 is variable, which is ongoing operational costs.
Okay.
Overall, the entire China operation represents less than 2% of their total global budget.
So, on an absolute dollar basis, the China investment is tiny. It's a rounding error. If the China expansion completely fails and goes to zero, it won't be the thing that bankrupts the NBA. The core business is already doing that.
Correct. The investment itself is structurally sound and highly asymmetrical, tiny financial risk for massive global upside. But the macro-financial bleed fundamentally changes the timing and the strategy. When a company is burning cash at that rate, every single dollar, every ounce of executive attention is critical for immediate survival.
You can't ask your executive team to focus on a complex Asian expansion when the domestic business is actively on fire.
Exactly. The analyst cannot simply say, go to China. That is reckless. The synthesis, the final output of the framework, must be highly nuanced. The recommendation becomes the market fundamentals in China are exceptional. You have high demand, perfect advertiser alignment, a competitive vacuum, and an exclusive 10-year moat. However, due to the critical cash bleed in the core global business, the expansion into China must be delayed or carefully restructured. You cannot aggressively expand a satellite operation if the mothership is sinking.
That is the raw power of the architecture. It prevents you from looking at a shiny, highly profitable satellite opportunity and completely ignoring the fact that the company can't afford the fuel to launch it.
Exactly.
Let's push this discussion past the boundaries of a single case study. I want to look at the broader, frankly ruthless structural forces that govern global capitalism, which this framework is specifically designed to detect. Within the competition and company pillars, there's a deep focus on the concentration of power, and analysts give it two very distinct names: the Walmart effect and the Intel effect.
Right. These are the forces of monopsony and monopoly power within a value chain. And if you don't understand them, they will dictate the survival of your company without you even realizing it. Let's start with the Walmart effect. This addresses customer concentration.
A monopsony, meaning a market situation where there is only one buyer.
Exactly. The framework asks, is there one dominant buyer in the market who holds all the cards? The Walmart effect occurs when a single massive customer possesses so much purchasing power that they can unilaterally dictate the terms of survival to their suppliers.
Let's use a mechanical metaphor to really understand this. It's like being a farmer in a town where Walmart owns the absolute only road out to the rest of the world. You can grow the best crops in the world, you can be the most efficient farmer, but they control the toll booth. They can raise the toll until you are making exactly one single penny of profit, and you still have to pay it, because otherwise your crops rot in the field.
That's a great way to put it.
Walk us through a specific supply chain scenario of how this squeeze actually happens.
Okay, let's imagine a mid-sized manufacturing company. They make plastic storage bins. They land a massive contract with Walmart. Suddenly, 50% of their entire global revenue is tied to this single entity. Year one is fantastic. Revenue explodes.
Yeah.
But year two, Walmart's purchasing department calls. They don't ask. They demand a 5% price reduction.
And the supplier has to say yes.
They have to say yes, because if they lose 50% of their revenue overnight, they default on their factory loans and go bankrupt. So they squeeze their own efficiencies, they cut employee benefits, and they hit the 5% reduction.
Ah.
Year three, Walmart calls back. They want another 5% cut, and they want the supplier to take on the cost of holding the inventory in their own warehouses until the exact moment Walmart needs it.
Just ruthlessly shifting the cost burden up the supply chain.
Continuously.
Yeah.
They suck the profitability entirely out of your end of the value chain. If you try to resist, they simply drop you and replace you with a competitor in a cheaper labor market who will comply because the sheer volume of Walmart's order is irresistible to anyone.
You become a captive supplier.
Yes. Operating on razor-thin margins, entirely dependent on the whims of a single corporate behemoth. If the business situation framework detects a Walmart effect in your customer base, your entire corporate strategy must immediately revolve around mitigating that catastrophic risk. You have to desperately try to segment and grow the non-Walmart portion of your business before you are squeezed to death.
It is a terrifying position to be in. But then there's the flip side. The framework also looks at supplier concentration, the Intel effect.
Right, this is when the power dynamics are reversed. Instead of one massive buyer, you have one massive indispensable supplier. The classic textbook example is Intel during the height of the PC era. If you were HP, Dell, or Compaq, you were manufacturing computers. But the actual heart of the machine, the microprocessor, came from Intel, and the market demanded it.
The famous Intel Inside marketing campaign, they trained the consumer to demand the component, not the box.
Precisely. Intel knew they were the indispensable bottleneck. You couldn't build a competitive PC without their chip. So Intel extracted all the profit from the entire industry. They charged premium monopoly prices for their chips, leaving the downstream manufacturers Dell, HP, to fight over pennies in a brutal low-margin price war on the retail shelves.
The suppliers sucked all the profitability out of the demand chain.
Yes. Whether the Walmart effect or the Intel effect, the framework is identifying where the structural power lies. If you don't understand who holds the power in your value chain, your strategic plan is useless.
Let's talk about how companies actively manipulate these structural forces to gain that exact type of power. I want a clear explanation of how a company weaponizes the company cost aspect of the framework. We need to talk about Amazon in 1998 and the deliberate manipulation of fixed versus variable costs.
This is a masterclass in artificially raising the barrier to entry.
Yeah.
We have to look at the proportion of fixed costs versus variable costs in a business model.
Stop right there. For someone who doesn't look at P&L statements all day, let's clearly define why Wall Street cares so much about this ratio. Why do financial markets generally prefer variable costs, especially for startups?
Variable costs scale with your sales. If you sell 0 items, your cost is 0. If you sell 1 million items, your cost scales up proportionally. It's incredibly safe. Fixed costs are the opposite. A fixed cost is the massive factory you'd have to build before you sell a single item. If you build a $100 million factory and sell 0 items, you are ruined. Wall Street loves variable cost internet startups because the financial risk is incredibly low.
Which brings us to early Amazon.
Right. In its infancy, Amazon was a purely virtual, low fixed cost business. They had a website, and they utilized dropshipping relationships with major book wholesalers like Ingram. When a customer ordered a book on Amazon, Amazon electronically pinged the wholesaler, and the wholesaler shipped the book directly to the customer.
Wow, okay.
Yeah, Amazon didn't hold massive inventory. They didn't own warehouses. It was a variable cost dream.
Which is a beautiful high-margin model. The problem is, if it's a low fixed cost for Amazon to set up, it's a low fixed cost for everyone else in the world.
Exactly. A low fixed cost mathematically equals a low barrier to entry. Because it was so cheap to set up this dropshipping model, there were literally 1,000 other online bookstores popping up within a year. Anyone with a web developer and a wholesale catalog could replicate the business overnight.
So what did Bezos do?
Jeff Bezos recognized that a low-barrier market inevitably trends toward hyper-competition, a race to the bottom on price, and ultimately zero margins. So in 1998, Bezos made a strategic decision that absolutely infuriated Wall Street. He deliberately spent $300 million to build out massive physical warehousing infrastructure across the country.
Wall Street hated it. Their stock took hits because it looked like a massive regression. I mean, why take a beautiful, scalable, high-margin internet company and saddle it with hundreds of millions of dollars in concrete, steel, forklifts, and physical inventory? It ruined their short-term profit margins for years.
Because Wall Street was looking at the quarterly P&L statement, Bezos was looking at the structural barrier to entry. By spending that $300 million, Bezos fundamentally altered the economic reality of the entire e-commerce industry. He forcibly transitioned Amazon from a low fixed cost business into a capital-intensive infrastructure behemoth. He essentially pushed $300 million in chips into the middle of the table and said to those 1,000 competing online bookstores, if you want to play in this market, you have to match my infrastructure to offer the same shipping speeds.
And none of them could. They were small startups. They didn't have the capital to build a national logistics network.
None of them could. You priced them out of existence by aggressively manipulating the fixed costs of the industry. And he didn't stop there. He continued to build moats. Amazon then undertook the massive task of scanning hundreds of thousands of book reviews, cover images, and eventually interior pages to make them keyword searchable.
Another massive, unrecoverable fixed cost.
Yes, if you wanted to compete with Amazon a few years later, you didn't just need a website. You needed $500 million in physical warehouses and a proprietary digital database of 100,000 scanned books just to sit at the table. It was a brutal, brilliant weaponization of structural cost barriers to create a monopoly.
It's the weaponization of capital. And the framework forces you to see that. It forces you to ask, are we vulnerable to low barriers, and how can we raise them? Let's look at another structural manipulation, but this time through the product pillar. We aren't talking about changing the manufacturing of a product or building warehouses, but changing the second and third order effects of adoption through packaging. I'm thinking about the explosion of the cell phone market in the early 2000s.
This is a perfect example of how the framework asks about complementary goods and packaging. Years ago, early cell phones were expensive, standalone pieces of hardware. You bought the phone for several $100s, and then you bought a plan.
Right.
Adoption was steady, but it was heavily limited by the upfront cost of the device. The manufacturing costs of the phone create a hard floor on the retail price.
So if it costs Nokia $200 to build the phone, they have to sell it for at least $250. That prices out millions of potential lower-income consumers.
Exactly. But then, the telecommunications industry had a structural realization. They realized they weren't actually in the hardware business, they were in the recurring revenue service business. The value wasn't the plastic and the silicon. The value was the monthly access fee to the network.
So they changed the packaging. They completely altered the economic paradigm without changing a single wire inside the product itself.
They began giving the cell phones away for near free or taking a massive loss on the hardware. But they bundled the phone with a mandatory multi-year service contract with heavy cancellation penalties.
Of course.
By shifting the profit extraction from the upfront hardware purchase to the long-term subscription, they radically lowered the initial barrier to consumer adoption. The market penetration exploded globally almost overnight. If an analyst only looked at the manufacturing cost of a phone and the retail price in isolation, they would have completely missed the multi-billion-dollar shift in the industry. The framework forces you to look at how the product is packaged, what it is bundled with, and where the actual economic value over time is being captured.
Okay, so the listener is sitting here absorbing this. They understand the mechanics of the Walmart effect, the Amazon fixed cost weaponization, the packaging pivots. This framework is incredibly powerful. But how does the listener who might not be sitting in a McKinsey boardroom or working at a global hedge fund actually train their mind to see the world this way? How do they build this analytical arsenal for themselves?
Well, there's a very pragmatic, highly actionable method for training this analytical muscle. It's often referred to as the magazine method.
Explain the mechanics of that. How do we actually play this game?
It involves using mainstream business publications, Fortune, the Wall Street Journal, Bloomberg, but you do not read them passively like news. You use them to reverse engineer complex business problems. You don't read the article to find out what happened. You read the headline to identify the structural problem, and then you try to solve it using the 4 pillars before you are allowed to read the conclusion.
Let's actually play the game in real time. Let's walk through the examples to show how a strategist thinks on their feet. I'm going to read a hypothetical headline, and you break down the framework application. Headline 1. United Airlines enters advanced talks to merge with major competitor.
Instantly, your brain should trigger. Okay, what framework applies here? This is an M&A situation, mergers and acquisitions. What are the structural drivers forcing a merger in the airline industry? You're on the pillars. Company costs. Is it about cost synergies? Can they combine maintenance hubs and reduce fixed overhead?
Makes sense.
Competition. Are they trying to consolidate market share to gain pricing power over a specific route, essentially creating a mini monopoly? Customer. Does combining loyalty programs create an insurmountable moat against smaller carriers? You don't care about the corporate drama. You care about the structural physics driving the deal.
Headline 2. Comcast debating tiered internet bandwidth speeds, proposing higher fees for faster delivery to content providers.
This triggers the industry and regulatory framework. This is a massive structural shift. They are trying to segment their customers, not the end user at home, but the content providers like Netflix or YouTube. Product pricing. They are attempting to change the pricing structure of distribution.
Right.
Competition barriers. If Comcast charges high fees for fast delivery, they artificially raise the barrier to entry for any new streaming startup that can't afford the fast lane toll. This immediately triggers massive regulatory blowback because it fundamentally alters the power dynamics of the internet. You analyze the incentives of the regulator versus the incentives of the monopoly.
Let's do one more, a classic new market entry. Headline 3. Citibank researching entry into the booming market of financing uninsured medical bills.
A classic business situation framework problem. A new market is growing at 30% year over year, buying hospital debt for massive uninsured procedures. Should a massive institutional bank enter this space, start running the pillars immediately. Customer. Who actually holds the debt? Is it the patient or the hospital trying to offload risk?
Right. Who's the actual customer?
It's exactly. Product. How is the debt packaged? Can it be securitized and sold to other investors? Company. Does Citibank have the internal distribution network and the collections infrastructure to handle medical debt, which has massive regulatory and public relations risks?
Okay.
Competition. Who else is currently buying this debt? Are they small, fragmented players, or are private equity firms already dominating this space?
Wow.
You practice mapping the framework onto real-world, unfolding economic events every single day. You sit with the table of contents of a business journal, and you just mutter the frameworks to yourself. It's about building the neurological reps.
So there's another crucial piece to this training. You can't execute the magazine method if you don't speak the language. You have to build the lexicon.
Yes, many intelligent people get paralyzed when analyzing global markets, not because they lack analytical logic, but because they are intimidated by the jargon. The language of high finance and consulting is designed to be exclusive. You have to create a literal dictionary for yourself. When you are reading these reverse-engineered cases and you encounter terms like economies of scale or price elasticity, you have to stop. You write them down, you define them mechanically.
Let's define price elasticity mechanically right now because it's a critical concept.
Price elasticity measures exactly how sensitive a specific customer segment is to a change in price. If we raise the price of our product by 10%, what percentage of our customers will stop buying it?
Give me an example of high elasticity versus low elasticity.
Low elasticity, inelasticity means the customer is captive. Think of insulin. If a pharmaceutical company raises the price of insulin by 20%, sales do not drop by 20% because the customer biologically needs it to survive. They will sacrifice other goods to pay the toll. That is highly inelastic.
And high elasticity.
High elasticity is a luxury good, like a mid-tier designer watch. If you raise the price 20%, consumers will simply substitute it for a different brand or not buy a watch at all. Demand drops sharply. If you don't understand the mechanical vocabulary of concepts like elasticity, you will get stuck staring at the terminology instead of solving the structural problem. The goal is to build such a fluency in the language of business that you can immediately see the underlying physics of the market. But all of this analysis, the frameworks, the vocabulary, the reverse engineering, the deep understanding of monopsonies and fixed cost moats is entirely useless if you can't actually deliver a decision. Gathering data for 40 minutes is an academic exercise if it doesn't culminate in action. How do you actually finalize this global strategy pitch? What is the architecture of the close? You have to be decisive. The framework dictates a very specific, uncompromising structure for the final pitch. It is 3 parts: conclusion first, insight second, and 3 big ideas backing it up.
Conclusion first. That is counterintuitive to how most people communicate. You don't build up a narrative suspense to the grand reveal. You start with the answer.
Absolutely. Executives do not have time for mystery novel. They want the answer, and then they want the structural load-bearing pillars that support the answer. In the NBA China case, the close sounds exactly like this. Based on the analysis, I recommend the NBA delay their aggressive expansion into the Chinese market and restructure the timeline.
Right. Leading with the recommendation.
Yes. Then the insight. While the external market is perfect, the internal financial bleed makes the venture highly risky to corporate survival. And then the 3 ideas supporting it. 1, unprecedented viewership demand and perfect advertiser alignment exist in China, creating a massive upside. 2, we have secured a 10-year exclusive regulatory moat, meaning the opportunity will not be stolen by competitors if we wait. And 3, the core global business is burning $10 million a year with only 36 months of runway, meaning all executive focus must remain on stabilizing the mothership before deploying capital to the satellite.
Boom. Conclusion. Insight. 3 pillars of logic. It leaves no room for ambiguity.
None at all.
We have covered massive ground today. We started with a 4-part checklist: customer, product, company, competition, and we used it to decode the mechanics of multinational expansions, the reality state media vacuums, the gravitational pull of Walmart's monopsony toll booth, and the billion-dollar fixed cost moats dug by Amazon. We've seen how elite analysts don't guess. They systematically isolate the hidden variables that drive global markets.
Mhm.
If you value these uncompromising, long-form breakdowns of global strategy and power dynamics, please like the video or the audio feed wherever you are listening. It signals to the algorithms that there is a real audience for deep dive analytical content, and it helps us continue to produce at this level. And I want you to engage with this material practically. Drop a comment below. Which structural force do you see as more prevalent and dangerous in today's digital economy? Do you see the Walmart effect, where a single massive platform, think Apple's App Store or Amazon's Marketplace, dictates terms to millions of captive suppliers and creators? Or do you see the Intel effect, where a single critical technology supplier like NVIDIA providing AI chips holds an entire downstream industry hostage? Let's get that debate going in the comments. Before we go, I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over. We have spent this time dissecting how these elite business frameworks are designed to ruthlessly identify competitive advantages, structural vulnerabilities, and barriers to entry in massive global markets. But scale that down, zoom in. What if you turned that exact same framework inward? How would your own career or your own personal skill set hold up if it were audited by the business situation framework? Who is your customer, your employer, your
Wow.
clients, and what is your concentration risk?
That's a great question.
Do you suffer from the personal Walmart effect, where one single boss or one single client holds 100% of your economic leverage? If they demand a 5% cut to your salary or demand twice the hours, do you have the structural leverage to say no, or are you a captive supplier? Most importantly, what is your personal barrier to entry? Have you spent your career building a low fixed cost skill set, something that 1,000 other people or a generative algorithm can easily replicate tomorrow with zero upfront investment? Or have you built the equivalent of Bezos's $300 million warehouses? Have you built a deep, complex, highly specialized infrastructure of knowledge, rare skills, and trusted relationships that requires a massive, unrecoverable investment of time for anyone else to match? If you are audited today, how deep is your moat? Think about it. We'll see you next time.